Good afternoon. I'm Joey Wender, the Executive Director of the Shelby Coalition, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled BEAD Updates: How Does It Impact Anchor Connectivity? So since its release a couple weeks ago, the new BEAD guidance issued by the Department of Commerce has generated countless questions throughout the broadband ecosystem. On today's webinar, we take on just one aspect of those questions. How does the new guidance impact anchor institutions around the country? That's why we've invited three outstanding telecom leaders to give their perspective on the changes to BEAD. We first welcome two Shelby members who are all-stars in the world of state broadband leaders. We have Christine Hallquist, who's the Executive Director of the Vermont Community Broadband Board, and Bree Mackey, the Executive Director of the Minnesota Office of Broadband Development. Both Christine and Bree are on the front lines of implementing their state broadband programs, and we really appreciate them spending their time with us today to help all of Shelby's members understand the new BEAD state of play. We also welcome Greg Geis. He's the Chief Policy Officer of the Vernonberg Group, whose extensive experience also includes a decade at the FCC, including as the FCC Director of Ledge Affairs. Before we get started, just a reminder about the logistics of the webinar. So the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website afterwards. Audience members are muted, but encourage you to use the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box to send us your questions, which we'll get to a little later in the webinar. And as always, you can follow us, Shelby, on social media at Shelby Coalition or hashtag Shelby Webinars. I also want to thank our corporate sponsors, Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, Cisco, and Tirana. We would not be able to engage in our work without their financial support. Okay, so now it is time to turn to the issue at hand. So let's start with Greg. As most of you know already, the new policy notice seeks to scale back the types of anchor institutions that were previously eligible under the original NOFO. Greg, can you explain the main differences between the original NOFO and the new policy notice that was issued a couple weeks ago regarding what anchors are eligible for BEAD funding?
Yeah, thanks, Joey, for the question. I appreciate it. So under the original NOFO and the IIJA, the law at issue here, NTIA was given a list of community anchor institutions that had to be included. What also Congress gave NTIA was the authority to provide some discretion to states to determine what other entities should be considered community anchor institutions for purposes of BEAD funding. And a number of states took an opportunity to expand that list to meet the community sort of anchor points in their state that may not be consistent across states. So it was a really nice opportunity to provide some flexibility to states to have a better connectivity with citizens around broadband connectivity and do so with robust broadband. Unfortunately, what the policy notice did is it basically said the NOFO is null and void as to that extension. And therefore, we have to revert back to only the statutory list. And so states are now going to be limited to funding what was in the statute, which is the more, I don't want to use the word traditional, but the more what people think of when they think of how this term community anchor institution has developed over the last decade. And so that's schools, libraries, and those sorts of entities in our communities. What I will also say at this point, though, is that it is statutorily based. That is one of the non-deployment funding activities. States have discretion to fund their community anchor institutions, which is a big distinction. Previously, BEAD funding was going to go through deployment, and if there was leftover money, you could get to the anchor institutions, which is part of your non-deployment activity as well. But just to be clear, the NOFO, this policy guidance says no non-deployment funding until we say otherwise. But footnote 2 says follow the statute. And the statute says community anchor institutions are eligible for funding. at the discretion of the state, not NTIA. So I think that's where we might want to focus a little bit of attention.
Right. Thanks, Greg. And and let's turn to the states on what this change in definition means. But the way we're reading it, Greg, is that the good news for anchors is that they are still eligible for funding and they're not falling on, the non-deployment side of the ledger at this point. They're still eligible for that funding to be connected. The issue is that the definition of what's eligible as an anchor has changed or narrowed.
Great.
Yeah. So, Christine, I know Vermont um, was speaking very creatively about what an anchor institution means, particularly given how many rural areas your state has. Talk to us about what the definitional change means in the state.
Well, if you look at the original language that came out of Congress, it does the schools, health, and libraries are still covered, right? And
That's right.
and the idea of being able to do telehealth is still there and exists. So typically we're gonna do that in our libraries. But we did have quite an extensive list, So and also the language still says we can serve some of the underprivileged populations. So we did cut the list down significantly. So for example, the ranger station in the Green River Reservoir State Park isn't going to be served anymore because we can't justify that. But if we look at the Brattleboro bus station, where a lot of homeless exist, we're going to keep that in there. And the schools and the libraries, of course, we think that'll be clean. We may get challenged on the Brattleboro bus station. So we're going to kind of push the envelopes for those areas where we know the homeless are served. But those areas that are clearly don't fall with the definition we're cutting out.
Bree, what's your experience and thought in Minnesota with how you were viewing anchor institutions and ways in which you're going to have to potentially call your list?
Yeah, so I would just start with Minnesota was a little different, I think, than some other states. We didn't believe we were going to have non-deployment money because of what our data said after doing this for 10 years. But that being said, what we did do, good, bad, or indifferent, is they're unserved BSLs, and we treated them like an unserved BSL in the unserved and underserved. So that's kind of where we talked and encouraged anchor institutions to go because of the not thinking we would get over here, and encouraging when we got to project areas that the providers would include that. I would just also add that we're certainly frustrated by the definition. We in our states all have a definition. We know hands on the ground what that looks like and why. And we also include that in our grants. So we've had 10 rounds of grants in Minnesota for 12 years. And, when we have a project application, that is part of it. And so we have been working on this. So we have maybe a lot less that were unserved. We have programs for the schools to get served already that don't go through our program. It's just happening. So we don't work directly necessarily with the lack thereof. So we're maybe a little unique, but we also care and really wanted those to be included. And so we snuck it in. I don't know if snuck it in, but we put it as an unserved BSL, and that's what they are at the end of the day.
Right. And I think I think Greg, the point he was making, I think is a very important one for our viewers to understand, right? There are lists of priority, and Bree is talking about how you're massaging those priorities. But, one of the things that I think that is coming out of this conversation with other states as well is there's a question of how much money would be left once you connect every home and business. And in Christine's case, in Vermont, there was going to be money left to connect all the anchors. As we're hearing, though, in some I don't know if do we call Minnesota a Western state, Bree? We call it a upper Midwest state.
Oh, Joey, we're Midwest.
I
Come
know
on.
you're the Midwest, but you're big. You're big.
We
Anyway,
are, yes, we
you're
are.
large. And a lot of those states, they're going to struggle just to connect every home and business, which means the question becomes much more um, irrelevant. Well, let's just back up for a second. We've talked about the definition, but I want to go back to Christine and Bree, and then we'll let Greg try to tie it together. There's in general, as I think everybody knows, has been discussed, there's been a removal of the fiber preference, right? That we're moving the benefit of the bargain is we're moving to a technology neutral stance and eliminating the fiber preference. So I think it's important to understand, and we know this will be different in different states, but let's start with Christine. How does removing the fiber preference impact anchors in Vermont, in your state?
You talk about our state, every time I get on these calls with our state, I realize how blessed Vermont is. We we talk, if you look at the amount of money we received, we're about 4 times the per capita average across the country. So we ended up getting more money than some of the states. If I look at the amount of money that New Mexico gets, there's no way they're going to get to all their addresses right. So,
Right.
and then there's a couple other things. If you look at the technologies, for example, unlicensed fixed wireless serves less than 1% of our population right now. So we don't have a threat from that, where some of the other states, they're 22, 25% unlicensed fixed wireless. So when we were pretty much technology agnostic right from the beginning. So we don't have a lot of changes happening. We're still plan on getting to about 95% of our locations with fiber, because we know the reason unlicensed fixed wireless doesn't exist in the state is because we have a lot of rolling hills and mountains. It's a lot different than the Rockies, for example, where you get to a peak and you can still serve a lot of area. Ours is, you go around the corner a half mile down the road, you don't get the signal because you've got these hills that are popping up all over the place, and we get a lot of foliage. So we don't have that threat of unlicensed fixed wireless. We're putting a real set of technical requirements for the low Earth orbit satellites, unlicensed fixed wireless, to go through it. We're actually, if you look at the new guidelines, the specifications haven't changed. So it really hasn't changed much for us, because we were pretty much technology agnostic right from the beginning. So
Thank you.
fiber, and just to close on that, once you have fiber hitting 95% of your addresses, you've got the capacity to serve 1 gig service to an anchor institution. So again, it doesn't, we don't have the same problem as the other states do.
And let's turn to Bree, and I'm glad Christine mentioned this. There is a different speed standard for our viewers between homes, 120, and anchors, which is gig service. And I think that you're hitting the nail on the head with our concern is that if you certainly don't have a terrestrial based network that's installed and deployed in a community, there's a real question mark of how on earth you would, pardon the pun, the terrestrial, I guess, how on earth you would achieve a gigabit service to an anchor institution. Bree, talk about what the new technology neutral approach means for Minnesota and particularly for anchor institutions.
Yeah, so I think just again, where Minnesota's at, we have statutory language and speed goals for which we need to hit in 2026, which, we don't know that we're going to get there, but we already had these 100 by 20 scalable. And so that was, that's our base. We are also guided by the legislature to create a program with BEAD, because we were in control, as closely aligned to border, which is our program, as best we can. We tried. But I think, as far as that goes, our border to border program is technology agnostic. However, you have to be able to hit these things, and we know certain technology does not hit these things. We also know the most difficult and hardest places to serve it in Minnesota are what's left. That's why we created the low population density program, which increases the partnership, public-private partnership investment. And these are areas where community anchor institutions are your local townships, your EMS that rely on volunteers, fire departments, same thing. And so again, these communities that deserve all of the things that we all can take for granted at sometimes are still sitting there. And I think that is a component that's sometimes really hard to swallow. Again, we tried to capture those and get them to, be on the BSL list if they don't have what they need. In most cases, cities have cable and they're served and all the things. So I would just, we have to be held accountable for the state and the residents here because they know the standard because Minnesota set it a long time ago. And now it's changed, and level setting expectations, being very transparent is part of the approach that we have taken, and I stand by. We don't do this in a bubble. Our internet service providers care about anchors as well. They're gonna run into folks, voting at the little township, whatever. And so I think there's a level of understanding that they also want this. Again,
And not to mention, Bree, that's just not to mention, Bree, anchor institutions, again, another pun, tend to be anchor tenants for ISPs,
yes,
right?
absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
Keep going. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Great ad. Please do. For a little while when the restructuring came out and not knowing about the non-deployment numbers, I thought, well, maybe we did miss an opportunity of throwing it in there just in case. But now with the non-deployment components moving out and the new CAI rules, then I feel like I didn't fail the state, or we didn't sort of maneuvering. And I think we are in a good space here because of the approach of just making sure BSLs get the service. And the quickest, easiest way to manipulate the system in a way that is meaningful without breaking any policy rules and all the things. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Greg, respond to tech neutral.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's look, I think the early days, it got a little overinflated at the role of fiber was going to play. When you got down to the bidding, technologies were going to have to compete and there were going to be winners and losers. And in a lot of the states, the benchmarks were set up in a way that the technology that could best serve the location would win. Unfortunately, I think a lot of folks kind of ran with this like, oh, that means, Starlink won't be able to compete. Well, Starlink was always going to be able to compete where they were best suited to serve, right? There are locations, I know folks have heard about the $200,000 location, but there's actually a clear justification for it. But there were always going to be spaces where LEO technology could help meet the needs, because if a state can't get to all the unserved, they can't get to the underserved or the community anchor institutions. So you wanted them to have a role to play, an appropriate role to play. I think what the notice does is try to shift that dynamic a little bit. I don't think it is as the end all be all, like Leo's going to win everywhere. First of all, they can't do it. But secondly, it really is like still leaves the states with some discretion to say who should be the appropriate technology to serve these locations. And if it happens that it's fixed wireless, fine. If it's unlicensed fixed wireless, okay. I know that a lot of states are already churning on that number and are getting some letters of intent already. But a lot of the unlicensed fixed wireless guys are even saying, look, we'd rather compete to upgrade technology as part of the BEAD program than rely on sort of excluding our locations because we serve the location with unlicensed fixed wireless. But all to say, this guidance does in some ways provide an opportunity for potentially even a little bit more money to be there for community anchor institution connectivity if it means that a few more fixed wireless and satellite locations come online, right? And so I think silver lining this, that could be the silver lining. There's a little bit more money to do work with community anchor institutions. And I love that, Christine, you said, you guys are going to sort of push the envelope because there is still an opportunity to expand that definition. But instead of NTIA telling you up front that you're approved to go, you've got to go to them and say, we think this is why. So that little shift is a bit problematic, but I do think I'm glad to hear that. But yeah, so I think that's the role technology neutrality can play. It could actually help reduce some of the cost on getting some of the homes and smaller businesses served, thereby reserving some funding for community anchors.
And Greg, and I apologize if there's background music. I now in a severe thunderstorm all of a sudden. Came out of nowhere. Greg, you also talked about, it's interesting, all the intended consequences and unintended consequences, right, of these changes. And right, maybe there would be a little more left over for community anchor deployment activities. But also, let's talk about non-deployment activities, right? So another way in which anchors were stood to benefit was from essentially digital equity work, right? We've long said that anchor institutions are the places oftentimes where digital equity work happens. Explain to our viewers that those activities, what's the status of those activities?
Great question. And I've been toying on this. I'm going to write something at some point this week. Hopefully I'll have some time. But what the policy notice said is that as it relates to non-deployment funding, for now, NTIA is going to suspend it, and you have to await further guidance. And if you can't submit a bill for those expenses unless they've been previously incurred. But await notice. Okay, so that's the top line. But as as lawyers, we go to the footnote. And in footnote 2, NTIA specifically says, here, I'll bring the language up. Don't want to be accused of mischaracterizing a federal agency. This document does not and is not intended to supersede, modify, or otherwise alter applicable statutory or regulatory requirements. In all cases, statutory and regulatory mandates shall prevail over any inconsistencies contained in this document. Okay, so it's saying like, hey guys, go look at the statute if you really want to do your work. 47 USC 1702 F number 5 says states have the discretion to determine whether to use grant funds for broadband adoption, including programs to provide affordable internet-capable devices. And if you look at what broadband adoption means, you have to go, the only place it's been defined by statute is in the Digital Equity Act, which is still law. And it says adoption of broadband shall include digital skills training, all the things that we think of when we think digital equity. So states are well-founded to say, we're going to set aside money to do this work. NTIA, the statute says it's our choice, not yours. And so state broadband offices hopefully will sort of encourage some thinking around what they can still do and reserve the funds that they can to do some of that good work. One last thing, NTIA does also say that they will not be looking for information on what states did regarding non-deployment funds as part of their final proposal. Now, I think they meant that to say, don't include that stuff in your proposal. But it also means states can kind of do what they want to do.
Right. And just to be clear, and I want to go to Christine next, is just to be clear, there's deployment, right, which no one's disputing, homes, businesses, and then anchors, and some or together, depending upon how you're doing the build. And then we're talking about the non-deployment activities, such as digital navigators and digital literacy programs at anchors and elsewhere. Christine, how are you? Greg, do I got that right?
You got that exactly right.
Okay. Christine, how are you thinking about the non-deployment side at this point?
Well, I will say, again, it's a state by state issue. You know, we're in good shape. We did a pre-proposal round, and we know that we have adequate funding to get to all of our addresses, and there will be money left over. So that money left over, that non-deployment fund, we're still looking at using those funds. Now, the first step, of course, is serving all the community anchor institutions. But once we're still continuing to move forward with the plan to provide devices and training. Now, we don't know if there'll be funds from the non-deployment activities for that. If there are, we will continue. But we know we have state funds that are continuing to support the program, much smaller than what was the digital equity component, but it's still there for us. Because if you look at, again, the digital equity program, we're also part of the 19 or so states that are challenging the assumption that the digital equity program was a DEI program. For us, it clearly was not a DEI program because 95% of Vermonters qualified. You know, it was about getting to those folks that can't use the service today. And if you look at those folks that are not served today, they're more than double the number of low-income folks. So it's targeting that group. So we're still focused on that. We're still moving forward with that in a much reduced way. But if we win the lawsuit, we'll expand back. But we'll also look how we can use non-deployment funds for that purpose. But again, priority. I actually, I think a lot of the NTI NOFO was really sound and good, and the idea that we serve CAIs before getting to non-deployment is very important because you got to have those CAIs there in order to provide the addresses, the devices and training. So it does flow well.
Thank you. Bree, was there going to be any money left in Minnesota?
All right, so we didn't think so. If we, we ran on the assumption states knew best and we're doing all the things. Again, guided heavily, but we did not think we would use non-deployment. Obviously, Christine shared the CAIs first, but can I just, I hope you will appreciate, jump a little bit. So states are so disappointed and in the Digital Equity Act and what has happened there. We have invested in incredible staff who have done the work, communities who have engaged with us across years working on our plan. The approach Minnesota took in our digital opportunity plan was, this is the state's plan. We are doing this because this is the state's plan, and we're going to submit that and use it for NTIA. So we have this solid plan, and we stand by it. But when it comes to BEAD, when it comes to non-deployment, because of all of this, in the past, I have been able to shift employees under equity within BEAD and use those funds to maximize the work we can do and work off of what we previously do. Now we're not allowed to do it. So a lot of states are left with nothing and how to fund this work that is extremely important. We're all talking about it right now. And so appreciate Christine sharing about all the states. I would just say I'm spending more time with legal than ever. And they're incredible here in Minnesota helping us through all of these because we're looking at statutory language and how it impacts and how the waiver and this, that, and the other. But I just really wanted to point out that, this is a heartbreak. And yeah, I mean, we worked really hard. The staff that led this work worked incredibly hard. And like many states, we just don't have that funding at this moment. Maybe next legislative session, but here's where we are right now. So I kind of diverted from the question. Simple answer is no, we didn't think so. But now we think we might. And I love that we will work that in somehow in what we submit as modifications or restructuring of our plan.
And Bree, thank you for bringing, I think both of you brought up DEA funding It's something that Shelby cares about deeply as well and shares your incredible frustration. And I think there was a note in the chat, Christine, again, there's at least a dozen and a half states that are suing that determination, correct?
Yeah, I think the number might be 14, but it's in the teens.
Great. Let's turn to another question in the chat while we've got two state broadband leaders on, and so much discussion has been put on timelines and redos and expedited new timelines. Give us a little taste about what all that means for your deployment, what that I think means in the long run for anchor institutions. We'll start with Christine and then Bree on what these the new benefit of the bargain round means.
Well, again, all the states are going to be a different position on this one. We made some, in retrospect, we made some good decisions. The big decision we made was we weren't going to change anything in our plan. We kept our nose to the grindstone. Our philosophy was if we didn't get it in writing, we're not changing anything. Well, that's really helped us a lot because we're actually going to finish faster now than we even did before. Now there's a couple of reasons why we're faster. We're also making it's forcing us to make decisions faster, but we've been talking about this enough. Our team has met. There is going to be some level of disappointment with the bidders because we're not going to change our project areas. We're moving fast to make that September 4th date. But we really want to make that September 4th date because we want to be in construction next year. Vermont has hard winters, and we want to get to, our construction season is short. We don't want to miss it. So September 4th sets us up very well for next year's construction season. What happens with the ISP up here, if your plan isn't in place by the end of November, you're going to miss next year. So we're taking advantage of this. And there are going to be some people angry with us because we're going to be inflexible. But we're also, I will also say that we're not questioning stuff anymore. In fact, our congressional delegation, I'm meeting with them this afternoon because they wanted to send this letter out. We're saying, hey, stop fighting this. The stakes have been put in the ground. We don't have time to fight this. We've had a couple meetings with Adam Cassidy, taking him on good faith. He really believe he knows what he's doing. There's a lot of people trying to second guess, say, well, it doesn't matter what you do. We're not doing that. We're taking everything in writing as it is. We're taking Adam Cassidy's word, and we're gonna move ahead with good faith. And when you think about this, really all we can do, but we don't have time to debate this anymore.
Bree?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Christine mentioned, including weather and ground freeze in Minnesota. So on a positive, yes, we will move hopefully a little quicker and actually see projects digging in the spring, but also recognizing that our internet service providers also are going to have to do a lot of work with final engineering and state and land use and all of the components, right of ways and pieces. So that takes time, but we're hopeful. If NTIA at their word is going to complete review in 90 days and give us the yes or no, and what we may or may need to change. To Christine's point as well, we're getting to work. We're reading the guidance, we're interpreting it the best we can, and we will put the best thing forward that we can within those parameters for the state. And if it's not accepted, then we do it again. We were one of the last states to get our volume 2 approved anyways, because we were working on things around statutory language and state priorities. And at the end, we just had to kind of go, okay, here's where we are, but we liked our plan. Would we have changed certain things if allowed? Yeah, but we were on we were on the path to doing this work. So I think, approaching this again in Minnesota, we're having conversations. We've already done a webinar. I'm reaching out to our partners and having some, group one-on-ones. And the other disappointing part of this is we value community engagement and community support. again, if you want adoption, if you really want adoption, you have to have communities that want the service and residents who want the service, which, you know, is a key part of this take rates. And so that's unfortunate. However, you know, I'm looking at all of my associations, whether it's the Child Care Association, the Rural EMS, I'll take all the letters of concern and support with me. And at the end of the day, that will represent well to the state of Minnesota. And again, that we're all working together on this. So I think, you know, that community support we added in our scoring rubric, that was really important to us. And unfortunately, that is not something that is valued at this point.
Greg, chime in here on state and local authority and decision making. I know that is I mean, I hear Christine say it is what it is. It's a lot of money. The program still exists. We're going to plow forward. I also hear a lot of frustration from Bree and from others about, especially, we had a great plan, right? We worked our butts off and really connected with so many community leaders. I know Vermont and Minnesota and everybody did, right? What is your concern moving forward with how NTIA is approaching states, having had states already go through this incredibly long, in many ways arduous process to come to what many believe were the right program plans that fit each state's needs.
Yeah. Joey, I literally said to somebody this morning, if only NTIA had the ability to have run this program like the program you ran over at Treasury, this money would have been out the door. But they didn't, they couldn't, whatever. But yeah, so here we are. And I think the greatest risk is, as you said, like states spent a lot of time
Mhm.
working through a very deliberate uh, form to think through some specific questions on how best to address the needs in their communities, recognizing that at that level, they're going to be very diverse in each of those communities. What this program has in some ways done, despite the fact that this is the Federalist folks, is say, no, 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 we think as a national matter, this is the way it ought to look. And so that's a little bit disappointing. And so to Bree's point, that community engagement falling out and a demonstration by the ISP that they cared about what the local folks thought about their opportunity in this network and that they talked to them about it out the window. Vermont did the same thing. In fact, insisted on that local engagement as part of their scoring rubric. Um, those things will fall to like just the state oversight role, I think now, I hope. And so states will have to say, look, you're going to sign this agreement, but you're going to tell us every quarter what you did to engage with your local community. And so it's more oversight than scoring. So I think hopefully that sort of mindset will get in. There is still some discretion left up to the states. Eligible entities get to decide whether or not a particular applicant meets the requirements of priority broadband and therefore gets to do the benefit of the bargain round and therefore could be within 15% and therefore force the state's hand. So I think there's a lot of interplay in that. And then on the community anchor institutions questions more specifically, um, it's hard to it's a bit hard to swallow given I know the outreach that was done in a lot of states to figure out who are the anchors that we need to try to help and who in your community matters in that regard and build that list. So but if states like Vermont move forward and say, hey, we're going to push the envelope on this and we're going to force NTIA to tell us no, maybe that's an opportunity as well. So I guess, Joey, what I would say is that there is still a lot of opportunity for states to shape their own destiny. Unfortunately, a lot of the more deliberate work in doing that has been jettisoned from an approval standpoint, and it might be good to think about ways that you incorporate that into your grant obligations going forward.
Thank you, Greg. I'm gonna give Christine and Bree the final word as we're reaching our time limit. each of you take a minute to give your final thoughts. I thought this has been an excellent webinar and really appreciated everybody's contribution. But I'll end with Christine and Bree.
Yeah, I'll piggyback right off what Greg said, because that's the approach we're taking. We did a lot of upfront work. That work, we're not considering that work a waste of time. We're considering it a building block to what we're going to do. And we're again taking the NTIA at its word. We see a way to thread this, maybe not in the same extent as we had threaded it before, but we're still going to thread. And so that's our approach. We're not rolling over by any means. And that's, and again, that's going to be a statewide state approach. Some states, their political position may be, hey, we're just going to go, do the minimum, but ours is not that case.
Thank you, Bree.
Yeah, and quickly I will just say, like, we have 64 days left of this 90 if you take in the public comment period and day 13 today. And so we're moving forward with what we have. Some people will get service. Like some people, this is a win. We just have to accept that it's internet for all is a different definition now. And so we're going to work really hard to maximize what we can, and a Band-Aid here, and Minnesota will get it done at some point. Like we're going to do this. We have statutory language. We have to, right? At some degree. We are resilient teams. I have an incredible team that is resilient as much and dedicated to this work. And many of us are impacted by the lack of broadband. Last thing I'll just say, reach out to your offices. Any ideas are great ideas. Let us think about this because it's happening so fast. And Joey, thanks for including us. Like this has been great. And I always appreciate hearing from my other directors who are now dear friends.
Thank you, Bree. Well, thank you, Bree, Christine, Greg, for this really great conversation. We have come to the end of the webinar. And as a reminder, if you've enjoyed these webinars, you should consider becoming a Shelby member. Shelby is the leading national advocate for affordable, high-speed internet for anchor institutions and their communities. And if you're already a member, please recommend that your colleagues join Shelby as well. Coming attractions, our next webinar will come as soon as the Supreme Court rules in the USF case, which we thought might happen today. It did not. The next court decision day is this coming Friday, and then again next week. And so as soon as that happens, we will have our third in a series of webinars with Jason Neal, our attorney at HWG, and Andy Schwartzman, our resident professor. They're really the two of the most knowledgeable attorneys working on the case. So please stay tuned for that. Finally, I would encourage everyone to attend AnchorNets. I know October feels like a long time away, but it is not for those of us on Shelby staff as we're busy planning it right now. It's the nation's leading broadband conference for anchors. This year's conference will be held October 21 through 31st here in DC. Finally, I want to thank again our sponsors, Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, Cisco, and Tirana for helping to make this webinar possible. And finally, thank everyone for attending this webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.